Hi, Rabbi.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome.
Hello, Kent.
Hi, everyone. John, you doing okay?
Yeah, good, fun, thanks. Yourself?
Fine, thanks.
Good.
Hi, guys.
Hi to you.
Hey, hello. Welcome all. Oh, lovely. Looks like we've got some new recruits. The new learning of the laws of Shabbos. So welcome. I'm Rabbi Hecht, for those who haven't met yet. Lovely to have you all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen now with the text of today's chapter. I usually try to read. I still haven't actually spoken to other teachers about exactly how they do the chapter. I generally try to read the entire thing in the Hebrew and translate, unless I see that we're running out of time, then I'll try to kind of paraphrase the Hebrew translations. It seems to have worked. On those days where we have a little bit of leftover time, we'll kind of pause at the end for some questions and discussion. Otherwise, we try to go straight through. I should say that if at any point somebody really doesn't understand something, you can kind of type into the chat or unmute yourself and can ask me to pause for clarification. Okay, so today's chapter, I'll keep talking as I'm sharing the screen. Today's chapter deals with what I guess we can call passive melacha. So there are certain prohibited activities on Shabbos, which the best way we can kind of define them is creative works. Certainly one is not allowed to do them on Shabbos, but what happens, and we'll see examples, if somehow these activities are left to be done, so to speak, on their own, passively on Shabbos, would this be allowed? And the simple answer is that yes, it can be allowed. The most common example is it is allowed and can be set up in that way that you start before Shabbos and it will continue through Shabbos. The most common example, and the one that we'll spend most time on in this chapter, is cooking on Shabbos, or allowing cooking to take place on Shabbos. However, as we'll see, that even though fundamentally allowing something to cook passively on Shabbos on its own, in and of itself, is not a malacha, it's not a part of the prohibited activities of Shabbos, it must be done in a responsible way, meaning it must be done in a way that we will not be tempted to somehow engage that process further on Shabbos and thereby transgress an actual biblical transgression. Okay, I see I've raised on the page the wrong chapter here, so let's go back one chapter because we are in chapter 3. And here he goes. So the opening statement is Shabbos. One is allowed to begin the performance of malacha before Shabbos, meaning in Friday afternoon towards Friday Eve, even though the malacha will continue on Shabbos passively. It will continue. Because the prohibition against doing the malacha is actually on the day, engaging in the process, that creative process. But if it's just going to happen on its own passively, we're allowed to benefit from that process. Excuse me, that which is happening on its own during Shabbos. Okay, so what are the examples? Shabbos. One is allowed to open up an irrigation channel into their garden before Shabbos, before it gets dark, and the water will continue to basically water the garden throughout Shabbos. Another concern would be lighting incense. On Shabbos, you can't do that, but you can light the incense under a garment. This, I guess, is some type of process that they would do when laundering clothing to allow the fragrance to seep into the clothing. So you could light that before Shabbos, prepare it before Shabbos, and allow that to seep into the clothing during Shabbos. Here he talks about putting on certain remedies or salves or bandages onto a wound that will continue to heal a wound throughout Shabbos, and that would be allowed. This is the process of creating ink So you would be allowed to leave these mixtures to soak over Shabbos, even though, again, engaging in that process on Shabbos, you could not do. You can be in it before Shabbos and allow it to settle or sit there over Shabbos. Another example would be setting up traps to trap wild animals, or putting out nets to catch fish, or other ways of catching birds. Again, you do it on Friday Eve before dark. They can then catch the animals, the birds, the fish throughout Shabbos, and you can then benefit from it after Shabbos, no problem. The time in Bekaris Beis Abad or Vigule Agas in Chashech or Mashkin Zomim V'Ochim Kol HaShabbos Kula, you're allowed to load the beams for an olive press or put in the stones of a grape press, also before nightfall, and this will continue to press either the olives or the grapes throughout Shabbos. Not a problem. It's happening passively without your direct input on Shabbos. You can set it up before Shabbos to do so. And one can light a fire or a candle from before Shabbos, and it will continue to burn throughout Shabbos. And once we now spoken about lighting a flame, we'll talk about pretty much the most common use of the flame on Shabbos, which is still relevant today, although most of us are not necessarily cooking up on an open flame. And therefore, much what the Rambam says here is not applicable exactly as it's expressed here. And we'll have to look to more modern kind of applications of the principles here. But you'll see the principles and you'll appreciate some of the practices you might be familiar with of how we approach allowing food to continue to cook on Shabbos. The principles will be the same. Some of the implements are slightly different, and therefore some of the precautions that were taken or applied somewhat differently than we do today, but you'll see the parallels quite clearly. So he says, for example, when we can place food on a fire, meat in an oven or over the coals so that they can continue to cook throughout Shabbos. So one would allow to begin the cooking process, and that cooking will continue on Shabbos. But there's a precaution over here. We have to be careful that we do it in a way that we will not end up, what he says here, stirring the coals on Shabbos. Basically, what he's saying, we've got to do it in a way that will create that barrier so that we don't end up transgressing an actual prohibition of Shabbos. So what are some examples? Ketzad. If you have food, you started cooking on an Erev Shabbos and it's not yet completely cooked. Or hot water that you're heating. Or something that has been cooked completely, but it's the type of food that if it simmers or if it remains on the flame, it gets better over time, right? Like a cholent. He says, you cannot just leave it on an open flame on Shabbos from before Shabbos because you're concerned that maybe you're going to stoke the flames. Basically, in each of these cases, you may be tempted to engage with that flame to make that cooking process go a little bit faster. So therefore, how can you do this? He says, therefore, if you move away the lit coals or you cover it, and he talks about different ways they might cover it with different implements so that it's not an open flame anymore, then we mitigate that concern that you might go towards it and stoke that fire. And in such an instance, you would be able to leave the flame on the fire. Practically speaking, although we won't be able to go into all the practicalities of how we apply this today on Shabbos, but many of you will be familiar with this concept of a blech. Blech is a Yiddish word, but blech is something that we put over our stoves on Shabbos. It's a metal plate, ideally, that covers the stove. Ideally, it covers also the knobs where you can manipulate the temperature of your stove. And the idea is like this: we can leave something on the flame that's not fully cooked, and it will continue to cook on Shabbos as long as we put something in place that reminds us or actually impedes the possibility that I might start to do something that I'm not allowed to do on Shabbos. The way he defines it yesterday is he says once in the examples that he gave there about pushing aside the coals or covering the coals with something, what I've done is I've kind of set my mind aside that I'm not going to no longer going to engage with that flame, and I'm safe therefore to allow it to continue to cook off the heat that remains there on Shabbos. Now he gives an example. He's going to refer to certain types of stoves or ovens that were commonly used back in Talmudic times, I suppose in his times as well. And the parallels today are obviously slightly differently. He explains over here. He says, when is it permissible to leave something on the flame, or at least in the oven or the stove, once you've moved away the coals or covered them? He says that's specifically Bakira Shehev Lemot. We're talking about that type of stove that has a moderate type of heat. Now, this is the drawing that he has here for Akira. Akira, the idea is that it has one flame with two or more kind of stove tops, if you want to call it that. We'll see another type of device soon that has only one stove top, which means it's a little bit hotter than Akira. And then we have a tanur, which is an oven, was an implement that had even higher level of heat. And we'll see the ones that produce high levels of heat, there's more concern about utilizing it to leave food there on Shabbos, even if I have taken some type of precautionary measures. So this precautionary measure that we've spoken about, moving aside the coals or covering the coals, that's good enough for Akira. Aval tanur, but an oven, I've got to, let me just, if you do a Google search, you'll find slightly different images of what a kira exactly might have looked like, or the other one is that we call a kupach or a tanur, and there may have been different versions of each of them. But the idea is that a kira is like got two hobs, a kupach has one hob, and the tanur is designed very differently, that its flame is much hotter. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a drawing that gives us some type of idea. It's not so clear, but the first one is the kira. That means that it produces the least amount of heat. The kupach is slightly hotter, and the tanur is the hottest of all. Okay. Again, you'll see that there were different. There were also different versions. If you go online, you'll see, through the archaeology and so on, they've found different type of these stoves or ovens that were used in ancient times. But what we do understand is, and the principles will follow through. That when you're talking about something that doesn't have so much heat, pushing away the coals is good enough that you can leave the fire on, the food on there to cook. Remember, we're talking about food that was not fully cooked, or food that is fully cooked but will improve with added fire. And we'll see that it's different if it's something that was completely raw or that would get ruined by additional heat. So again, he says that would apply to the kira but not to the tanur. So, but when it comes to the tanur, even if you did all those things, or any of those things that we spoke about, you cannot then leave something on that flame on Shabbos that is not yet fully cooked, or that is fully cooked but will improve the longer it sits on the fire. He's saying because since it's still actually producing a significant amount of heat, it's not as if you completely have put aside the possibility of kind of generating more heat even. In other words, whatever the fire is being produced from can easily be reignited, and you therefore in the tanur we still consider that you might still reach out to do something that would ultimately be a completely transgression of Shabbos. So we're still concerned, and therefore you cannot leave those fires, food on if there wasn't fully cooked, or that will still improve with further heat over Shabbos. And he clarifies, why should you not be allowed to leave it in this tanur, which is the hottest of all those type of ovens, even though you've removed the coal, so to speak? He says, because the person can remove only the majority of the coals in their most intense heat. But because it's such a hot place, it's actually impossible to remove everything. He's saying because we're quite certain that you wouldn't actually be able to remove it completely. Because of the heat, whatever remains there, you may be tempted then to kind of, like we say, stoke it a bit to increase the heat further, to make that process of cooking a bit faster. Hakupach, so as we said, this is a third type of oven or stove. It's similar to the first kira that we spoke about, right? Except that it only has one range, as he translates it here. He calls it a range. Okay, so the kira has two or more. The kupach, as we talk about, only has one, and therefore is a higher level of heat. So he says like this. So here we have like a middle way of dealing with this. He says, "Im is the kuba gefas over 18. How do you kataner the imash mesechai lo agava velo simchana lo tafshel shlei bashkot cirkai omis tavayafa." So he says it's similar to the oven, so that if you just covered it, right? If you're using wood or gefet is like the remains from the olive press. If you're using that as fuel, which creates a lot of heat, then it's similar to the oven. You wouldn't be allowed to leave things there that will improve over Shabbos, either because it hasn't cooked fully or it's cooked fully, but it will benefit from further cooking. So that would apply even if the fire was removed or covered with ash, if the fuel that we were using was the type of fuel, wood or gefet, that reaches a high intensity. But he says if straw or stubble was used as fuel, it is down on the same rules as the kira that was fueled by straw or stubble, and the food may be left on it. And here he clarifies what's the difference between the kira, what he translates here as the range, and the kupach. He says the kira is a place where you have two pots, and a kupach is a place where you only have one pot. So basically what he's saying is the kupach creates greater heat. So if you're using a fuel that creates an intense heat, we treat it like a tanner, and you cannot leave food there. That will be improved. If you're using substance that doesn't create such an intense heat, like straw or stubble, then we treat it like a kira. Now, all that we've spoken about over here is that it was either food that's not fully cooked, or it's fully cooked and will improve with simmering or staying on a fire. And that's where theoretically you can do it, but you only do it if you've implemented some of these mitigating factors, so that you won't be tempted to engage with it on Shabbos, stoke it on Shabbos. What about raw food? Raw food. Or it's completely cooked, and by cooking it further, it's actually going to be detrimental to the food. Then you can leave it on the flame. Why? Again, because he has no cause to want to maybe stoke that flame. Remember, biblically, allowing it to cook is not a problem. All these halachas where we expect like a mitigating element is a rabbinic law to help us stay away from the concern of transgressing a biblical command. The fact that it's continuing to cook is not the problem. It only becomes a problem when allowing it to continue to cook is done in a way where I may be tempted to actually engage with the fire. And because something raw is not going to cook, basically what we're talking about really is like this, is that, you know, like a cholent, for example, is going to stay overnight. You know, we're more worried about the things that you might want to eat Friday night, that if you don't raise the flame quickly, it's not going to cook fully, right? So those are things we worry about. So if it's completely raw, no problem. Or if it's something that's going to get ruined by additional heat, we're not worried. It's now he says also, if you had a pot of food that was cooking and you added something raw, or you added something that would get ruined by stoking the flames. So even though most of it was something that was not fully cooked, or was fully cooked and would be improved with the flame, as long as you put something included into it that would be ruined by extra flame or wouldn't be helped, we're not worried. He's saying because once you add something that you know is going to take a long time to cook overnight and you're not going to start stoking the flame, that's good enough. Again, it's a rabbinical concern that you might engage with the fire. So they say as long as you've done something obvious that kind of what we call diverts your attention from it, that's fine. Halacha 9. If you left something on the flame that you should not have, again, we're talking about an open flame, food that was not fully cooked, and now into Shabbos it's fully cooked. Now you didn't touch the fire, but the rabbis added another precaution on the end. They said as follows: you cannot eat that until after Shabbos, if you did it intentionally. So you did it intentionally, you know you shouldn't have done it. You didn't necessarily touch the flame, so you haven't transgressed Shabbos, but still they say, now you're feeling bad on Shabbos. Oh, I did something I shouldn't have done. But it's a Shabbos meal, can I eat it? So according to halachas, you can't eat it. You can only eat it after Shabbos, and after Shabbos, you should wait the amount of time that it takes for it to cook before you actually eat it. Whatever if you did it by mistake. You didn't do it intentionally. If it's something, the example was that it was cooked, but it wasn't completely cooked. So it means on Shabbos, it was cooking in a way that it shouldn't have been cooked rabbinically. Then you got to leave it till after Shabbos. So you don't, but you don't have to wait the extra amount of time because it was only done unintentionally. If it's the type of food that actually was fully cooked, but by remaining on the flame, it just got improved, that you can actually eat on Shabbos. So theoretically, if it was a challenge, right, that you left on an open flame, that was not yet fully cooked before, it was cooked before Shabbos. It was cooked before Shabbos. But overnight, it got improved. But it was improved on a fire that you should never have allowed it to remain on because it wasn't covered or it wasn't pushed aside. That, if you did it unintentionally, if you did it by mistake, you would be allowed to eat that on Shabbos. Obviously, this idea, this sanction is that a person shouldn't get used to doing this. The sanction that the Rabbi said, if you did it intentionally, even though you didn't do the malacha, right? Still, we don't want you to get used to this type of behavior because this was the whole idea of creating these barriers to ensure that we do not transgress the biblical prohibitions of Shabbos. Halacha Yud. Now this is another halacha. What we've spoken about until here is what we term in halacha shehiyah, leaving it on the flame. Now what we're talking about over here, what we're referencing is chazara. What is if you left something on the fire that you were allowed to leave on the fire, and now you took it off the flame? Can you return it to the flame? So that is not allowed on Shabbos if it's cooled down already. And food may be returned only to a kira from which the coals have already been moved, or where you're talking about a kopach, right? Because an oven we said you're never allowed to return to because you weren't allowed to leave it there to begin with. But he's saying even in instances where you can return, and we'll speak about what that is, because as a rule, you don't put it back on the fire if it cools down. But one of them, you took it off and you want to put it back, there are times when you can. So if it was a kira, which was the lowest type of heat, right? And you took it off. So he says, then you could put it back when, provided, as he goes on the Nimi and says, God, provided the food was not placed on the ground. But again, it can only go back onto something which you're allowed to leave it on to begin with. You can't put it into an oven. Practically speaking, the way we would do it today is if you took something off the stove, let's say it's the cholent, right? And it's on a stove that's covered, so it's permissible. It was mostly cooked before Shabbos and it was left on the stove to cook overnight. And you want to check inside if it's how it's looking. So what you would do is you could take it off the stove top that is covered. You can lift the lid. We'll learn that you're not allowed to lift the lid while it's on the flame. You can lift the lid to take a look. You can put the lid back on. The idea is that when you took it off, you had intention to put it back on, and you never allowed it to be put down onto the ground. You were constantly holding it. Then technically you'd be allowed to put it back. But to take it off and leave it on the side, and then a few minutes later just come back and put it back on the flame, that's not a line. That's the first line that he was talking about. Okay. So again, if it was put on the ground, it may not be. If it was placed on the ground, it may not be returned even to a kira whose coals were removed. He says similarly, food cannot be returned to an oven or to a kupach that was heated with, as we said earlier, those type of fuel gefet from the lifters from the olive press wood, because it creates a high intensity heat. And those particular implements, even if the coal was removed. Okay, whenever food should not be returned to a cooking service, should not be placed next to it. In other words, next to that source of heat to keep warm. Halacha 11. You're not allowed to stick a ladle or a spoon directly into a pot on Shabbos. In other words, you've challenged on the pot or your soup's on the stove and you want to serve from the stove. You cannot do it while it's still on the flame. Why? He says because when you stick a spoon in to serve, by automatically what you're doing is you're stirring. And stirring is something that is complementary to the cooking process. So it's like you cooking on Shabbos. We're not going to do that. This goes back to what we said earlier. If you've taken it off this one stove, you can put it from one stove to another, even if the heat levels are slightly different. But you're not going to take it off a source of heat like a kira and then wrap it, cover it completely, or vice versa. If sometimes you would cover something to retain the heat. You're not allowed to uncover it and put it onto a stovetop, a kira, or vice versa on Shabbos. Halacha 12. Lo yamala odem kedei asisois us surmusin or chavis shamayim yitin atechataner ev Shabbos im chashecha v'yasha oisem. You shouldn't fill a pot. Here he talks about peas and beans or a jug with water and stick it into the oven, because these things, we're talking about things that cook very easily. She'elu v'kol ki yitzben afa bi shaloi boshu kol ikar b'katavshil shaloi boshu kol turkey hebnei she'en tzrichin bishul hayver v'daita alei lochnata. No, we spoke about putting raw things on the fire immediately before Shabbos because we're not concerned that you're going to stoke the flame because it takes a long time to cook. There we're talking about things that take so long to cook that you're really only intending to eat it the next day. But if you put things into the oven that are easy to cook, and maybe you're going to want to eat it still tonight, there is still this concern that you might stoke the flames, and therefore those type of foods you can't put on, even if they're raw, basically, just before Shabbos. And again, and if you did this, you actually would not be allowed to use it on Shabbos. You have to leave it till after Shabbos, and then you can only eat it from after Shabbos for a time, waiting a time that it would take for those things to cook. 13th halacha. So he says, if you place meat into the oven before nightfall, you leave it there to roast. So if it's from a gedi, from a kid, meaning it's very tender flesh, that's permissible. Because such meat requires only the warmth of the fire itself. And if one stirs the coal, what's going to happen? You're actually going to burn the fire. You're going to burn it. So here we're talking about if stirring it is actually going to ruin it. Again, each of these cases are where there's no concern that you might engage with that fire. But if it's meat from a goat or an ox, he says that would be forbidden. Why? Because if you stirred it, you would actually increase the cooking process, and we're worried you might do that. However, if you put it into an oven and you sealed it off completely, meaning you're not going to have access to the flame to play with it, that would be permitted, because basically if you were to open it and the wind enters it, and then we're talking about a situation where that itself will cause the meat to go bad, to spoil, to harden, and we're not worried that someone might do that. Halacha 14. Anything that would get spoiled by the wind, we don't have this kazari that you're not going to leave it because the Torah might open it up and stir the coals. For the same reason, you could put strands of flax into an oven. This was part of the process of bleaching, because if somebody would open that oven, the wind, the air would cause it to get ruined, and therefore we're not worried someone's going to open it and stoke the flames. What is it? So we spoke about a gedi, a kid's meat, that it's kind of tender. So if you stoke the flame, what's going to happen? You're going to overcook it. That's going to burn it. That's a problem. But what if you stuck the entire animal in? So then it's compared to like the meat of a more sturdy type of thicker meat, like that of a goat or an ox, and one would not be permitted to do that. Again, the concern is that you might end up stirring the coals, which is the prohibition of on Shabbos. Again, unless you actually seal the oven where there's no concern that you're open. Mutter, the shalshal kevetz pesach lataner in chashecha v'afapisha in a tachlis neshabnei chabura zizanei. You would be allowed to hang the paschal lamb, right, which goes directly over a fire on Erev Shabbos, even though it's not sealed. Why? Is it because you're always cooking your Korban Pesach in the presence of company, and people would be looking out for each other to make sure that nobody actually stoke the flames in a way that would transgress the prohibition of Shabbos. Ein toinem basar or batel or beitza al gabi ha'esh ela kadei sheyitzeinim ba'yoyim v'yiruin la'achila. Meat, onions, the eggs should not be roasted over an open fire, right? The kira and all these other ones, it was you're putting it onto something not directly on the flame. Yeah, you're cooking directly in the flame. So all these things you should not do it unless it's roasted before nightfall, to the degree that it's already fit to be eaten, and then you can leave it on the fire to be roasted further. What is the degree that something can be eaten? So in the halachic term is like Ben Drusoi. There was these bandits that used to only partially cook their food, Ben Drusoi, and that is considered, and there is discussion in halacha exactly how much it is. Is it 2/3 cooked or more or less?
No.
But once something is, once we consider something that to be basically edible,
Right.
then you can still leave it over this open flame. And again, the rationale is that the increased heat, rather than in other words, we always worry that maybe you're going to engage with the fire. Over here, the idea is that if it's already mostly cooked and you start to increase the heat, you're actually going to do damage to it rather than improve the cooking. And that's why one would also be allowed to leave incense on the clothes before nightfall. For if one stirs the coals, the incense will burn and the clothes will be damaged by the smoke. As we said previously, also this idea.
Rot in his name.
Okay, halacha 17. He clarifies over here. All these things that we said one is not allowed to do on Shabbos, leaving food that was not yet cooked fully on an open flame, or on a flame on a tanner or a kira or a kupach that wasn't cleared out in a way that is appropriate. All these things are not because the continued process of cooking on Shabbos is prohibited. As the passive cooking is prohibited, but it is all what he calls here a rabbinic decree, a gezerah, that we are concerned that you might actually engage with stoking the fire, which would be a prohibition. Therefore, wool should not be placed in the vat to dye unless it was removed from the fire, because over there also there's a concern that you might start stoking the coals. And similarly, a vat should be sealed with clay, so that nobody should stir it after Shabbos has come in with the nightfall. Halacha 18. Now, here we talk about a process of cooking bread where they would take the dough and they would stick it against the sides of the oven. And basically the outside of the dough would, certainly one that was attached to the wall of the oven, would get kind of crusted very quickly, and then it would kind of cook through. So he says like this: you should not place bread in an oven directly before nightfall, nor should we place a cake on the coals. That was another way they put it directly onto the thing. Unless there's time for the surface of it to crust over. In other words, so that first stage of the cooking actually takes place. So you got to do it enough time before nightfall that will take place. And then it's permissible to leave it to continue to baking afterwards. Because at that point, once the outside is crusted, if you start to increase the heat, it's only going to be bad for the bread, not good for the bread. So to put it on directly just before Shabbos is no good. There has to be enough time that the outside will crust first. Further, he says, what happens if you place it there just before nightfall and it did not yet get crusted over? If you did it on purpose, if you did it on purpose, you knew what time it was, you knew what you were doing, you put it into the oven, you can't eat it till after Shabbos, and plus the time that it actually takes to cook. If you did it unintentionally, you didn't realize that it was coming up to so close to Shabbos yet, or that this wasn't allowed, then you would be allowed to remove at least enough bread that you can use for the basic meals of Shabbos. But you should not use the baker's kind of scraper that you would usually use. You got to do it in a different way, indicating that this was not an ideal kind of situation. So you take a knife or something else that's not the usual way of scraping those breads off the side of the oven. Halacha 19. Here we're talking about generally a fire, not necessarily for cooking, but a fire for warmth or for light. You can build a fire. You can kindle a torch, light it as you wish. Before Shabbos, you can use the light and warm yourself from it. If you're lighting a fireplace, basically, you got to make sure that most of it has caught with flames, that it's alight before Shabbos. If it just started to catch, but it's not like a proper fire yet, then you're not allowed to take benefit from it on Shabbos. And again, the same concern that we had by the cooking. The problem is that if you're sitting in front of a fireplace and you got a few pieces of wood that are kind of just barely catching, and now Shabbos comes, it's not yet a raging kind of a fire, we worry maybe you're going to start to move things around in order to increase the flame, and then you're going to transgress the prohibition of Shabbos. And if you're talking about one log of fire, make sure the majority of it is taken with the flame before Shabbos, and then you can use it for its benefit. Where does this apply? He says this applies in your own homes, outside of the temple premises. But we'll see here that there's an exception in the temple premises. There are other exceptions of Shabbos laws that we'll learn about what took place on the temple premises itself. But yeah, we're talking about there was the Beis HaMoked, chamber of the hearth, where they would have a fire where the Kohanim could go in to warm themselves. So there, he says they would be allowed to start the fire just before Shabbos. They didn't have to be concerned that necessarily the whole thing was alight and the flames burning the majority like we do in our own fireplace at home. And the reason he gives over here is because generally the Kohanim were known to be careful in their behavior, and we're not concerned that they may start stoking those flames or moving them around to increase the fire. Now, if the fire wasn't wood that requires a bit of time for it to generate the flames, but it was reeds or seeds or something, then you don't have to worry about it making sure that most of it is lit before Shabbos. You can use it on Shabbos. Why? Because those things catch quickly, and we're not worried that you're going to do anything to manipulate that process. Therefore, if reeds were bound together or the seeds were placed in palm baskets, the same law applies to wood would apply, because there, obviously, now that's in a bundle, now that's in a pack, it's going to take time for the flame to catch, and there we would be concerned that you might stoke it, and therefore you've got to make sure that the flames are caught properly on the majority of it from before Shabbos. And Father Alochen in this chapter 22, Medur shel zephes, oil shel gofres, fire that's filled with tar, sulfur, oily substance, wax, straw, stubble. One is not required the majority to be kindled before Shabbos begins. Again, because these things kindle or illuminate, catch fire quickly, and that concern of maybe you're going to touch the flame, stir the flame, is no longer a concern. Okay, so we managed to cover the entire chapter. It's a couple minutes longer than we usually do. If there are any questions,